The Electric Light Orchestra, otherwise known as ELO for quite a lot shorter, were an art rock band from Birmingham in the UK. You've probably heard of them. They were formed by several members of a band called The Move in 1970, initially under the leadership of a guy called Roy Wood, who then went and formed a band called Wizard. He left during the recording of their second ELO album, and Jeff Lynne took over and quite famously has pretty much led the band since. So they soon had a settled lineup which continued until the splintering that happened in the late 80s. So it would be easy to think that there was one faction led by Bev Bevan, who had been the bassist for quite a long time, and one led by Jeff, but that is a huge simplification. Bev led a band that carried on when Jeff took a break, which at times was called ELO Part 2, at times was called The Orchestra, at times was called Orchestra with a K, and at times was called ELO. But Jeff reformed a band called for a long time ELO, and then more recently Jeff Lynne's ELO, to distinguish it from the other version that was going on. At what point it was possible for two bands called the ELO to be performing in different towns on the same night. I had the pleasure myself to see ELO Part 2, led by Bev Bevan, twice. They were simply incredible. I absolutely adored those evenings. And I have been a long-time fan for ELO ever since I heard Mr. Blue Sky when I was 11. Their sound started by being an experiment in using classical strings in rock. The strings element continued all the way through. Their main violinist for quite a long time was a guy called Mick Kaminsky, who was a prominent member. They also use synths a lot, and particularly well. If you follow the Jeff Lynne strand, they have had 15 studio albums. Hi, my name's Dan. So this was the fourth album by ELO, and it was released before they became mega successful with their more popular stuff later, particularly with their album Out of the Blue. I've loved ELO for years. I've had a copy of this album since my mid-teens, when I bought a vinyl copy as part of a three LP box set called 3 Light Years, which had this album, Face the Music, and On the Third Day, which were 3 consecutive ELO albums from earlier in their career. So for me, listening to this brings a huge bucket load of nostalgia. I had a really nice listen in the car, and sang along a bit, a lot. And I will say also, I reviewed this a few years ago for a different series that I was doing, and some of this review is based on that. This is, I would say, an extraordinary album. So for some albums, I think it's all about an attitude and putting forward a kind of, a scene or a feel. Punk was very much like that. For some albums, it's all about the music. For some, it's all about the lyrics. Sometimes you get songs that are stories, but I love it when we get the whole album as a story, and it goes beyond the idea of atomics and separate songs and becomes a continuous whole. And I think it's one of the best uses of the form of the album. So I would say these days the genre that is doing the best job most consistently on this is rap. And if you've watched quite a few of these reviews, you'll realise that I'm not a huge fan of rap, but this is one thing that I'm really going to give credit to rap for, is doing the concept album. So this is a concept album. It's about a story about a man escaping from life through his dreams, but as it does that, it blends the ideas of death and sleep quite interestingly together. Jeff Lynne created the story before he wrote the songs. It definitely holds together as an entity. I think it is best listened to as a whole in the right order. But there are several songs here that work equally well, I would say, as standalone songs. I'm also going to say that possibly my least favourite, and that's by no means I don't like the songs, are the first two songs on the album. And it blends a lot in between rock and classical, and there's large musical interlude stuff going on. So lyrically, it's fairly typically ELO stuff. It's kind of fantasy, given the story setting. So it's generally about dreamlike story fantasy stuff. And that works quite well. There's some nice points. My favourite tracks here are Nobody's Child and Illusions in G major, which definitely conjure up mental images. Some of the other parts are more vague. I think my biggest criticism of this album is that in places the words are hard to hear because the production on the vocals is quite mushy. And that's something that actually was typical of the early ELO albums. It was quite hard to get consonants out from the mushiness of the vocals. So it was a bit of a shame. Where the album really hits it, though, is the music. So, as I said, it blends classical sounds and textures, and it's got an orchestra and a choir, and it does that seamlessly with rock band sounds, often kind of going to and fro and in and out, and it's such a way that it all makes sense, and you kind of forget that there's meant to be this divide between classical and rock, because it just does both, and it kind of uses them together or shimmies from one to the other. Stylistically, it does a similar thing, so it uses classical feels and rock feels and everything that could kind of sit in those gaps in between. And it does it with great intelligence and invention. Musically, I absolutely adore this album. It's great. So, like classical music, it has repeated themes, motifs that come throughout. Harmonically, it all makes sense. Somehow, there's a kind of choice of chords that's very Jeff Lynne ELO stuff, and I'm not sure I could tell you what that is or why, but it feels familiar, and somehow that harks back to the Beatles, particularly kind of the late 60s Beatles stuff. So some would label this as progressive rock in that it's got experimental elements, it's innovative, it crosses the boundaries of music, and it's a concept album, and of course it's a fantasy concept. But it does something that a lot of progressive rock doesn't do, which is that it has a huge amount of accessibility as well. So it has the accessibility of pop. So it has hook lines and it has singable choruses, and it also follows a principle that I would say ABBA absolutely perfected, which is that at any single point in time when you listen, there's something interesting to focus your listening on. So there's either lyrics or solo lines or tunes or quirks in the arrangement. So I would label this as progressive pop, definitely. As you've got it, you picked up, I really love it, and I think the thing that's kind of ironic is that there's at least 3 ELO albums that I like more than this album. And there's going to be some reviews for at least one of those coming up. I think it's an exceedingly good album. What do you think? I'd love to have your perspective on this, so please talk to me through the comments box. That's it from me for now.
Stop that closet in on me, painted lady. You're supposed to be a dream.